racism and slavery to just. Have you looked at some of the things that are being reviewed?
Slavery was a bad thing that we should talk about.
Okay.
Like, he forgave
He's not whitewashing slavery. So
he's not?
He's not. No, okay. He's not. And you cannot tie imperialism and racism and slavery to just one race, which is pretty much what every single exhibit does. But let's talk about the fact that when you
can't tie slavery,
let's talk about the fact
that slavery in America was.
Do you realize that only less than 2% of white Americans owned slaves?
But it was a system of white supremacy.
You realize that slavery is thousands of years old?
Beyond embarrassing for CNN and even Jillian Michaels to broadcast this.
And Jillian Michaels was like, it's so unfair that slavery in this country only gets blamed on one race. Look, as outrageous as that is genuinely funny. Like, look, I'm not gonna tell anybody how to feel, but if you heard the words I said, that Jillian said, and you immediately got angry, I would ask you to take a step back. I'm not going to tell you how to feel. You can be angry if you want to be angry, because it is a very short-sighted, ignorant thing to say, but that's precisely why it's so funny. And it's so funny, too, because when it comes to history like that, there are always these bad actors that try to pull the thinnest straw man out of the woodwork, you know? There'll always be that person.
Exactly. And considering we didn't know of Jillian Michaels since her show, The Biggest Loser, her MAGA influencerness needs attention.
And it was the first race to try to end slavery? Well, what's controversial?
I'm very surprised.
This is an extraordinary exercise in historical revisionism.
I'm really surprised.
Do you realize that?
Jillian, I'm surprised that you're trying to litigate who was the beneficiary of slavery and
I'm not. What I'm trying to tell you is that
in the context of American history,
okay.
In the context of American history, what are you saying is incorrect by saying that it was white people oppressing black people?
Every single thing is like, oh, no, this is all because white people bad. And that's just not the truth. Like, for example, every single exhibit, I have a list of every single one. Like, people migrated from Cuba because white people bad. Not because of Castro. Yes, no, it's in there. That's what I'm saying. You don't actually know what's in there. Do you know that when you walk in the front door, the first thing you see is the gay flag?
Thus, seeing how she made it previously, she knows how to become table fodder and the ire of many online.
And it makes sense to me that someone like Jillian Michaels would say something like this. She is from a reality TV show. She's known for the show The Biggest Loser. Yeah, that's who she is, that coach from The Biggest Loser. You know, the nice one. The Biggest Loser was a show, I don't think it's still on the air anymore, so if you're not familiar with the show, it was a show where they would bring on people who were overweight, struggling with image and everything, and they would help them lose weight by making them do slavery.
Please support this wonderful comedian by going to youtube.com/Josh Johnson Comedy.
This has been an installation there. Is gender testing fair in sports? Does that, and then it goes on to talk about how it's complex to do gender testing in sports. It's not complex. It's basic science. That's untrue. It's XX chromosome, XY chromosome. That's sports. Is it fair to have biological men competing against biological women in sports? No. But why is this in the Smithsonian? So it's been completely captured.
To say this is unhinged is a severe understatement.
Actually, really interested to know. Do you know the statistics on slave owning? No, it was only 2% of people back then owned slaves. That means 98% of white people had nothing to do with slavery, and people constantly make everything about race, and that's why the Democrats continue to lose, and they're not trying to erase slavery. That is a false narrative that is brought to you by the woke mob that continues to try to put men and women's sports, and they need to remain separate. I'm a personal trainer. I know XY chromosome. It's science. Okay, men lose weight easier than women, and it's not fair, but it is what it is. Just as slavery is not all white people.
Sandra Vasquez on TikTok also got in on the fun. You've seen her bits where she tears apart Caroline Leavitt.
And it's totally partisan.
We don't. First of all, we don't have time to litigate all of this.
Of course we don't, because then you're going to lose the argument. Everything is racialized, just like you're trying to do to me now.
Excuse me.
It's like, I can't believe you're trying to suggest, that slavery
just to be clear, you brought up race.
No,
this was a conversation about the arts, and you brought up race.
At this point, it's fair to ask, why is she there? She has no political background. She just became a political influencer last election cycle. What does she bring?
Every one of those exhibits that we're talking about, you brought up slavery. I was talking about art and the exhibits, and all they do is bring up white imperialism. It's not just white people. Okay, we've bent history to be a forgiveness. I stood shoulder to shoulder with people for that George Floyd situation, and now
she says they bent history. Now, come on, lady.
What? It's white people's fault that there's black on black crime. That's what it sounds like to me. Okay, we need to stop being the biggest losers and be the biggest winners. You don't get it. No, it's fine. You don't get it.
You brought up,
but the whole point of this is that the issue
you brought up slavery, and you brought up the question of whether you brought up the question of whether or not slavery in the United States is about race. The answer is yes.
Slavery in the United States don't straw man my argument, because that's not what I said.
So what are you
brought
talking
up
about?
Slavery. And what I was talking about is that this isn't really about that. When you make every single exhibit about white imperialism when it isn't relevant at all, that is a problem. So when you're talking about Cubans leaving Cuba and you make it about white people bad,
they're acting like we don't exist. We never existed. That's what they're acting like.
that's not accurate.
Can I just say,
That's my point.
All right, we're going to move on.
In times like these, no offense to her, actually, offense to her, it's wise to listen to the experts. Thus, let's hear from Nicole Hannah-Jones.
Let's take the fewer than 2% of white people owned slaves at face value, though we know that number is technically incorrect. If we want to play the numbers game, the much more important measure is what percentage of Americans owned slaves? No, but what percentage of those empowered did? Before 1865, the end of slavery in the United States, 63% of U.S. presidents had been slave owners at some point in their lives. More than 1,800 members of Congress owned slaves, meaning between 1789 and 1819, more than half of the men elected to Congress each session were slave owners. What about the Supreme Court? 26 of this nation's first 30 Supreme Court justices were enslavers, and about half of all the Supreme Court justices before the Civil War were enslavers. So many Supreme Court justices were enslavers that if we added up all the Supreme Court justices coming all the way to this present court, 1 out of 4 of all Supreme Court justices in this nation's history were enslavers. All but one of the people on our cash currency engaged in African slavery. Look at the $1 bill, $2 bill, 10, 20, 50, 100. All these men engaged in slavery. It's weird that we didn't value all those non-slave holding white people enough to put them on our money. The majority of the most powerful men in this country, the men who made the federal laws, interpreted the laws, and enforced the laws, built their wealth on African slavery. And I assure you, that number says much more about the country we inhabit than that 2%. During the height of slavery, it was not the Northeast, Boston or New York, but the Mississippi River Valley in the Deep South that had more millionaires per capita than anywhere in the nation. And the Confederacy, had it succeeded at being a separate country, would have been the 4th richest nation in the world when the Civil War started. Enslaved people in the U.S. produced 7/8 of the world's cotton supply, and slave-grown cotton constituted 50% of all U.S. exports, making it the #1 export in America. And the North was completely intertwined in slavery, so much so that at the start of the Civil War, New York City actually considered seceding from the Union because the economy of the nation's trade capital was so heavily reliant on slavery. White enslavers financed their operations through New York banks, protected their enslaved property through New York insurance companies, and transported their slave-grown cotton on New York ships, flooding $200 million into New York's economy every year. Enslaved people built the famous wall that Wall Street is named after. Famous companies such as Lehman Brothers are rooted in slavery. The Lehman Brothers began as cotton brokers in Alabama before moving to New York to help establish the New York Stock Exchange. Brooks Brothers made not only fine suits, but slave cloth outfits to clothe the enslaved. Domino Sugar dominated based on slave-grown sugar. As a result, by some estimate, New York received 40% of all U.S. cotton revenue. They didn't have to own the slaves to profit greatly from slavery. Northern states may have outlawed slavery, but they continued to profit off of slavery and the slave trade. We learn about the marvels of the Industrial Revolution, but that revolution was made possible not just by technology, but by cheap slave-grown cotton. Rhode Island outlawed slavery in 1787, but built its economy on the slave trade. 60% of all ships in the U.S., slave ships, left Rhode Island, and they spawned an entire enterprise to support these slave traders, shipbuilders, sailors, carpenters, rope makers. James DeWitt, he was a Rhode Island slave trader, and when he died in 1837, he was the second richest person in America. I could talk about how, quote unquote, only 2% of white people owned slaves. By the time of the Civil War, the United States, the land of the free, had the largest enslaved population in the world. That the value of those enslaved people, that human property, was greater than all of this nation's factories, railroads, and banks combined. In other words, the United States economy and political systems were built in significant part by slavery. This is simply undeniable. Without slavery, our nation would be unrecognizable to us.
Hey, I appreciate you watching. Now, if you can, please do become a channel member by going to youtube.com/tytsports and clicking the join button. If that's too much for you, you can just go to tyt.com/join to become a member. It helps all of us out here at the Young Turks and keeps our network afloat. In addition, you can follow me on my socials, on Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. Appreciate the love. Have a great day.